Hello, and welcome back to Story Time with Eric Zimmer, where we last left off in Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. Not only did we get back to the Chocolate Factory, but Mr. Wonka, wanting to get the other three old grandparents out of bed, decides to give them something he used to make an Oompa Loompa younger. Something called Wonkavite, where each pill makes you 20 years younger. Imagine that. I'd be a little boy again. Anyways, I wonder if this will convince them to take it. Anyways, so you ready? Alright, let's begin. Chapter 15. Goodbye, Grandma Georgina. Goodbye, Georgina. Uh-oh, I've got a bad feeling about this. When Mr. Wonka had finished reading the recipe, he carefully folded the paper and put it back into his pocket. A very, very complicated mixture, he said. So can you wonder it took me so long to get it just right? He held the bottle up high and gave it a little shake and put the pills rattling loudly inside it, like glass beads. Now, sir, he said, offering the bottle first to Grandpa George. Will you take one pill or two? Will you solemnly swear, said Grandpa George, that it will do what you say it will and nothing else? Mr. Wonka put out his free hand on his heart. I swear it, he said. Charlie edged forward. Grandpa Joe came with him. The two of them always stayed close together. Please excuse me for asking, Charlie said, but are you really absolutely sure you've got it quite right? Whatever makes you ask a funny question like that, said Mr. Wonka. I was thinking of the gum you gave to Violet Beauregard, Charlie said. So that's what's bothering you, cried Mr. Wonka. But don't you understand, my dear boy, that I never did give that gum to Violet? She snatched it without permission, and I shouted, Stop! Don't do it! Spit it out! But the silly girl took no notice of me. Now Wonkavite is altogether different. I am offering these pills to your grandparents. I am recommending them. And when taken according to my instructions, they are as safe as sugar candy. Of course they are, cried Mr. Bucket. What are you waiting for, all of you? An extraordinary change had come over Mr. Bucket since he had entered the chocolate room. Normally, he was a pretty timid sort of person, a lifetime devoted to screwing caps onto the tops of toothpaste tubes in a toothpaste factory had turned him into a rather shy and quiet man. But the sight of the marvelous chocolate factory had made his spirits soar. What is more, this business of the pills seemed to have given him a terrific kick. Listen, he cried, going up to the edge of the bed. Mr. Wonka's offering you a new life. Grab it while you can. It's a delicious sensation, Mr. Wonka said, and it's very quick. You will lose a year a second. Exactly 1 year falls away from you every second that goes by. He stepped forward and placed the bottle of the pills gently in the middle of the bed. So here you are, my dears, he cried. Help yourselves. Come on, cried all the Oompa Loompas together. Come on, old friends, and do what's right. Come make your lives as bright as bright. Just take a dose of this delight, this heavy magic dynamite. You can't go wrong, you must go right. It's Willy Wonka's Wonkavite. This was too much for the old people in bed. All three of them made a dive for the bottle. 6 scrawny hands shot out and started scrabbling to get hold of it. Grandma Georgina got it. She gave a grunt of triumph and unscrewed the cap and tipped all the little brilliant yellow pills into the bottle on her lap. She cupped her hands around them so the others couldn't reach out and snatch them. All right, she shouted excitedly, counting them quickly. There's 12 pills here. That's 6 for me and 3 for each of you. Hey, that's not fair, shrilled Grandma Josephine. That's 4 for each of us. 4 each is right, cried Grandpa George. Come on, Georgina, hand over my share. Mr. Wonka shrugged his shoulders and turned his back on them. He hated squabbles. That makes two of us. He hated it when people got grabby and selfish. Let them fight it out among themselves, he thought, and he walked away. He walked slowly down towards the chocolate waterfall. It was an unhappy truth, he told himself, that nearly all people in the world behave badly when there is something really big at stake. Money is the thing they fight over the most. But these pills were bigger than money. They could do things for you no amount of money could ever do. They were worth at least $1 million a pill. He knew plenty of very rich men would gladly pay that much in order to become 20 years younger. He reached the riverbank below the waterfall, and he stood there gazing at the great gush and splash of melted chocolate pouring down. He had hoped the noise of the waterfall would drown the arguing voices of the old grandparents in the bed, but it didn't. Even with his back to them, he still couldn't help hearing most of what they were saying. "I had them first!" Grandma Georgina was shouting, "so they're mine to hand out." "Oh no, they're not," shrilled Grandma Josephine. "He didn't give them to you, he gave them to all three of us. I want my share, and no one's going to stop me getting it," yelled Grandpa George. "Come on, woman, hand them over." Then came the voice of Grandpa Joe, cutting in sternly through the rabble. "Stop this at once," he ordered. "All three of you, you're behaving like savages." "You keep out of this, Joe, and mind your own business," said Grandma Josephine. "Now you behave yourself, Josie," Grandpa Joe went on. "4 is too many for one person anyway." "That's right," Charlie said. "Please, Grandma, why don't you just take 1 or 2 each like Mr. Wonka said, and that will leave some for Grandpa Joe and Mother and Father." "Yes," cried Mr. Bucket, "I'd love one." "Wouldn't it be wonderful," said Mrs. Bucket, "to be 20 years younger and not have aching feet any more?" "Who said you had aching feet?" "Could you spare just 1 for each of us, Mother?" "I'm afraid not," said Grandma Georgina. "These pills are especially reserved for us 3 in bed. Mr. Wonka said so." "No, he didn't." Aw, look how sad he is. Don't you just want to hug him now? I do. "I want my share," shouted Grandpa George. "Come on, Georgina, dish them out." "Hey, let me go, you brute." "That's your husband you're talking to," cried Grandma Georgina. "You're hurting me." "Ow! All right. I'll share them if you stop twisting my arm. That's better. There's 4 for Josephine, 4 for George, and 4 for me." "Good," said Grandpa George. "Now who's got some water?" Without looking around, Mr. Wonka knew that 3 Oompa Loompas would be running into the bed with 3 glasses of water. Oompa Loompas were always ready to help. There was a brief pause, and then, "Well, here goes," cried Grandpa George. "Young and beautiful, that's what I'll be," shouted Grandma Josephine. "Farewell, old age," cried Grandma Georgina. "All together now, down the hatch." Then there was silence. Mr. Wonka was itching to turn around and look, but he forced himself to wait. Out of the corner of one eye he could see a group of Oompa Loompas, all motionless, their eyes fixed intently on the direction of the big bed over by the elevator. Then Charlie's voice broke the silence. "Wow," he was shouting. "Just look at that. That's fantastic. It's incredible." "I can't believe it," Grandpa Joe was yelling. "They're getting younger and younger. They really are. Just look at Grandpa George's hair. And these teeth," cried Charlie. "Hey, Grandpa, you're getting lovely white teeth all over again." "Mother," shouted Mrs. Bucket to Grandma Georgina. "Oh, Mother, you're beautiful. You're so young. And just look at Dad," she went on, pointing at Grandpa George. "Isn't he the handsomest thing?" "What's it feel like, Josie?" asked Grandpa Joe excitedly. "Tell us what it feels like to be back to 30 again." "Wait a minute. You look younger than 30. You can't be a day more than 20 now. Well, that's enough, isn't it? I would stop there if I were you. 20's quite young enough." Mr. Wonka shook his head sadly and passed a hand over his eyes. He had been standing very close Had you been standing very close to him, you would have heard him murmuring softly under his breath, "Oh, dearie, dearie me, here we go again." "Mother!" cried Mrs. Bucket, and now there was a shrill note of alarm in her voice. "Why don't you stop, Mother? You're going too far. You're way under 20. You can't be more than 15. You're 10. You're getting smaller, Mother." "Josie!" shouted Grandpa Joe. "Hey, Josie, don't do it, Josie. You're shrinking. You're a little girl. Stop her. Somebody. Quick!" "They're all going too far," cried Charlie. "They took too much," said Mr. Bucket. "Mother's shrinking faster than any of them," wailed Mrs. Bucket. "Mother, can't you hear me, Mother? Can't you stop?" "My heavens, isn't it quick?" said Mr. Bucket, who seemed to be the only one enjoying it. "It really is a year a second." "But they've hardly got any more years left," wailed Grandpa Joe. "Mother's no more than 4 now," Mrs. Bucket cried. "She's 3, 2, 1. Gracious me, what's happening to her? Where's she gone? Mother? Georgina? Where are you? Mr. Wonka, come quickly. Come here, Mr. Wonka. Something frightful's happened. Something's gone wrong. My old mother's disappeared." Mr. Wonka sighed and turned around and walked slowly and calmly back towards the bed. "Where's my mother?" bawled Mrs. Bucket. "Look at Josephine!" cried Grandpa Joe. "Just look at her, I ask you." Mr. Wonka looked first at Grandma Josephine. She was sitting in the middle of the huge bed, bawling her head off. "Wah, wah, wah," she said. "Wah, wah, 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 wah." "She's a screaming baby," cried Grandpa Joe. "I've got a screaming baby for a wife." Literally. "The other one's Grandpa George," Mr. Bucket said, smiling happily. "The slightly bigger one there crawling about. He's my wife's father." "That's right, he's my father," wailed Mrs. Bucket. "And where's Georgina, my old mother? She's vanished. She's nowhere, Mr. Wonka. She's absolutely nowhere. I saw her getting smaller and smaller. In the end, she got so small she just disappeared into thin air. What I want to know is where she has gone, and how in the world are we going to get her back?" "Ladies and gentlemen," said Mr. Wonka, coming up close and raising both hands for silence, "please, I beg you, do not ruffle yourselves. There's nothing to worry about." "You call it nothing," cried poor Mrs. Bucket, "but my old mother's gone up the spout and my father's a howling baby." "A lovely baby," said Mr. Wonka. "I quite agree," said Mr. Bucket. "What about my Josie?" cried Grandpa Joe. What about her?" said Mr. Wonka. "Well, a great improvement, sir, said Mr. Wonka. "Don't you agree?" "Oh, yes," said Grandpa Joe. "I mean, no! What am I saying? She's a howling baby." "But in perfect health," said Mr. Wonka. "May I ask you, sir, how many pills she took?" "4," said Grandpa Joe glumly. "They all took 4. Mr. Wonka made a wheezing noise in his throat, and a great look of anguish came over his face. "Why, oh, why can't people be more sensible?" he said sadly. Uh-oh. Look at them. This is not good. Why don't they listen to me when I tell them something? I explained very carefully beforehand that each pill makes the taker exactly 20 years younger. So if Grandma Josephine took 4 of them, she automatically became younger by 4 times 20, which is... Wait a minute now. 4 times 2 is 8. Add a naught. That's 80. So she automatically became younger by 80 years. How old, sir, was your wife, if I may ask, before this happened? She was 80 last birthday, Grandpa Joe said. She was 80 in 3 months. There you are, then, cried Mr. Wonka, flashing a happy smile. The Wonka fight worked perfectly. She is now precisely 3 months old, and a plumper, rosier infant that I've ever set eyes on. Now wait a minute. Didn't the original book say each of them was over 90, and that Grandpa Joe was 96 and a half? And now they're said to be around 80. Oh well. But still, that does create a bit of a plot hole, don't you think? Yeah. But anyways. Nor me, said Mr. Bucket. She'd win a prize in any baby competition. First prize, said Mr. Wonka. Cheer up, Grandpa, said Charlie, taking the old man's hand in this. Don't be sad, she's a beautiful baby. Madam, said Mr. Wonka, turning to Mrs. Bucket, how old, may I ask, was Grandpa George, your father? 81, wailed Mrs. Bucket. He was 81 exactly. Which makes him a great big bouncing 1-year-old boy now, said Mr. Wonka happily. How splendid, said Mr. Bucket to his wife. He'll be the first person in the world to change your father's diapers. He can change his own rotten diapers, said Mrs. Bucket. What I want to know is, where's my mother? Where's Grandma Georgina? Aha, said Mr. Wonka. Oh, yes indeed. Where has Georgina gone? How old, please, was the lady in question? 78, Mrs. Bucket told him. Well, of course, snapped Mr. Wonka. That explains it. What explains what? Snapped Mrs. Bucket. My dear madam, said Mr. Wonka, if she was only 78 and she took enough Wonkavite to make her 80 years younger, then naturally she's vanished. She's bitten off more than she could chew. She's taken off more years than she had. Explain yourself, said Mrs. Bucket. Simple arithmetic, said Mr. Wonka. Subtract 80 from 78 and what do you get? -2, said Charlie. Hooray-ease, Mr. Bucket. My mother-in-law's -2 years old. Impossible, said Mrs. Bucket. It's true, said Mr. Wonka. And where is she now, may I ask, said Mrs. Bucket. That's a good question, said Mr. Wonka. A very good question. Yes, indeed. Where is she now? You don't have the foggiest idea, do you? Of course I do, said Mr. Wonka. I know exactly where she is. Then tell me. You must try to understand, said Mr. Wonka, that if she is now -2, she's got to add 2 more years before she can start again from naught. She's got to wait it out. Where does she wait? Said Mrs. Bucket. In the waiting room, of course, said Mr. Wonka. Boom, boom, said the drums of the Oompa Loompa band. Boom, 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 boom. And all the Oompa Loompas, all the hundreds of them standing there in the chocolate room, began to sway and hop and dance to the rhythm of the music. Attention, please, they sang. I'm afraid if I sing this, I'm going to blow my voice out, so... My God, and it's a long song too, so... I think I'll pass on this one. Maybe I'll do a recording of it some other day. Anyways... Aha! This is where it gets more interesting. Chapter 16. Vita Wonk and Minus Land. It's up to you, Charlie, my boy, said Mr. Wonka. It's your factory. Shall we let your Grandma Georgina wait it out for the next 2 years, or shall we try to bring her back right now? You don't really mean you might be able to bring her back, cried Charlie. There's no harm in trying, is there? If that's the way you want it. Oh, yes, of course I do. For Mother's sake especially. Can't you see how sad she is? Mrs. Bucket was sitting on the edge of the big bed, dabbing her eyes with a hanky. My poor old mother, she kept saying. She's -2, and I won't ever see her again for months and months and months, if ever at all. Behind her, Grandpa Joe, with the help of an Oompa Loompa, was feeding his 3-month-old wife, Grandpa Josephine, from a bottle. Alongside him, Mr. Bucket was spooning something called Wonka's Squadgemallow baby food into 1-year-old Grandpa George's mouth, but mostly all over his chin and chest. Big deal, he was muttering angrily. What a lousy, rotten bust-up this is. They tell me I'm going to the chocolate factory to have a good time, and I finish up being a mother to my father-in-law. Everything's under control, Charlie, said Mr. Wonka, surveying the scene. They're doing fine. They don't need us here. Come along. We're off to hunt for Grandma. He caught Charlie by the arm and went right dancing towards the open door of the great glass elevator. Hurry up, my dear boy. Hurry up, he cried. We got to hustle if we're going to get there before... Before what, Mr. Wonka? Before she gets subtracted, of course. All minuses are subtracted. Don't you know any arithmetic at all? They were in the elevator now, and Mr. Wonka was searching along among the hundreds of buttons for the one he wanted. Here we are, he said, placing his finger delicately upon a tiny ivory button on which it said, Minus Land. The door slid shut, and then with a fearful whistling whirring sound like The great machine leapt away to the right. Charlie grabbed Mr. Wonka's legs and held on tight. Mr. Wonka pulled a jump seat out of the wall and said, "Sit down, Charlie, quick, and strap yourself in tight. This journey is going to be rough and choppy." There were straps on either side of the seat, and Charlie buckled himself firmly in. Mr. Wonka pulled out a second seat for himself and did the same. "We are going a long way down," he said. "Oh, such a long way down we are going." The elevator was gathering speed. It twisted and swerved. It swung sharply to the left. Then it went right, and left again. And it was heading downward all the time. Down and down and down. "I only hope," said Mr. Wonka, "the Oompa Loompas aren't using the other elevator today." "What other elevator?" asked Charlie. "The one that goes the opposite way on the same track as this." "Holy snakes, Mr. Wonka, you mean we might have a collision?" "I've always been lucky so far, my boy. Hey, look out there. Quick!" Yeah, that's exactly what he said in the original book, too. Through the window, Charlie caught a glimpse of what seemed like an enormous quarry with a steep, craggy brown rock face. And all over the rock face there were hundreds of Oompa Loompas working with picks and pneumatic drills. "Rock candy," said Mr. Wonka. "That's the richest deposit of rock candy in the world." The elevator sped on. "We're going deeper, Charlie. Deeper and deeper. We're about 200,000 feet down already." Huh. As if that's even possible. Strange sights were flashing by outside, while the elevator was traveling at such a terrific speed that only occasionally was Charlie able to recognize anything at all. Once he thought he saw in the distance a cluster of tiny houses shaped like upside-down cups, and there were streets between the houses and Oompa Loompas walking in the streets. Another time, as they were passing some sort of a vast red plane dotted with things that looked like oil derricks, he saw a great sprout of brown liquid spurting out of the ground high into the air. "A gusher," said Mr. Wonka, slapping his hands. "A whacking great gusher. A splendid, just when we need it." "A what?" said Charlie. "We've struck chocolate again, my boy. That'll be a rich new field. Oh, what a beautiful gusher. Just look at it go." On they roared, heading downwards more steeply than ever now, and hundreds, literally hundreds of astonishing sights kept flashing by outside. There were giant cogwheels turning and mixers mixing and bubbles bubbling and vast orchards of toffee apples and lakes the size of football fields fitted with blue and gold and green liquid, and everywhere there were Oompa Loompas. "You realize," said Mr. Wonka, "that what you saw earlier on when you went around the factory with all those naughty little children was only a tiny quarter of the establishment. It goes down for miles and miles, and as soon as possible I shall show you all the way around slowly and properly. But that will take 3 weeks. Right now we have other things to think about, and I have important things to tell you. Listen carefully to me, Charlie. I must talk fast, for we'll be there in a couple of minutes." "I suppose you guessed," Mr. Wonka went on, "what happened to those Oompa Loompas in the testing room when I was experimenting with Wonkavite. Of course you did. They disappeared and became minuses, just like your Grandma Georgina. The recipe was miles too strong. One of them actually became minus 87. Imagine that!" "You mean he's got to wait 87 years before he can come back?" Charlie asked. "That's what kept bugging me, my boy. After all, one can't allow one's best friend to wait around his miserable minuses for 87 years. "I'd get subtracted as well," said Charlie. "That would be frightful." "Of course it would, Charlie. So what did I do? Willy Wonka, I said to myself, if you can invent Wonkavite to make people younger, then surely to goodness you can also invent something else to make people older." "Aha!" cried Charlie. "I see what you're getting at. And you could turn the minuses quickly back into pluses and bring them home again." "Precisely, my dear boy, precisely. Always supposing, of course, that I could find out where the minuses had gone to. The elevator plunged on, diving steeply down towards the center of the earth. All was blackness outside now. There was nothing to be seen. So once again, Mr. Wonka went on, I rolled up my sleeves and set to work. Once again I squeezed my brain, searching for the new recipe. I had to create age, to make people oldest. Aha, I cried, for now the ideas were beginning to come. What is the oldest living thing in the world? What lives longer than anything else? A tree, Charlie said. Right you are, Charlie. But what kind of tree? Not the Douglas fir, not the giant redwood, not the sequoia. No, my boy. It is a tree called the bristlecone pine that grows upon the slopes of Wheeler Peak in Nevada, USA. You can find bristlecone pines on Wheeler Peak today that are over 4,000 years old. This is a fact, Charlie. Ask any dendrochronologist you like, and look that word up in the dictionary when you get home, will you please? I'll do that after I finish reading. So that started me off. I jumped